pursued. Just as we are trying to reconstruct the future of South Africa, it seems to be so apt we should be exploring at the same time the construction of its past. However, I'm going to remain true to my promises of a few words. Let's cut the formalities short, and I hope you have a most fruitful colloquium together. I look forward to reading the conference proceeding. Let's proceed with history.
Ladies and gentlemen, speaking for myself, I am very relieved that Professor Julian Cobbing is safely among us this evening, because without him the proceedings would be like Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. And as a non-historian, I'm also relieved to know that he really exists. His major intervention in the Mfecane debate has given him an almost mythical persona, a latter-day Shaka that has sent his roads-based amabuto in all directions, creating mayhem amongst the peaceful agro-pastoralists, both the uplands and the lowlands. Whether our discussion of the Mfecane will be Eurocentric or Afrocentric remains to be seen. All I know is it's going to be Cobbing-centric. And now I call upon him to take up his particular well-honed Mshlobagas, which for those of you who don't know is the war axe of Rider Haggard's famous black hero in King Solomon's Mines, and smite the Amalekites hip and thigh.
Just click at your jersey. Yeah, you can. Okay, this one's available.
Please forgive all these adjustments. I suppose my job is to be provocative and to open things provocatively. Or rather I would like people to get into a strong debating mood. It's a chance that won't come, perhaps again. I want to ensure that the essential principles of the debate are understood right from the very beginning, so that there can be no misunderstanding about what is being argued. We'd very much like it if you could express your viewpoints about these matters in the next 2 or 3 days. One way or the other, we'd like some resolution to the debate. It shouldn't be too gentlemanly. I think you should not be afraid of speaking your mind as firmly, if not as abruptly as you can make it. We will reply according to the same ground rules. The debate is centered on something which is extremely simple, but in the nature of academic debates, the response has tended to complicate things. And I want to get back to the simplicities tonight. And I want to first start with what it is that is being criticized. A thing called the Mfecane. We spell it these days in small letters. We do not italicize the word Mfecane. You can pronounce it as cack-handedly as you wish, because it's not an African word, and we insist on inverted commas. This is a transitional phase before the word disappears completely from the books, the essays, conversation, conferences, and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, we must start with what it is, because there has been some adjustment in definitions going on recently. I'll come to that. the Mfecane is this Zulu explosion, which I've tried to draw on this overhead projector map. You can see there, and you can read this in just about any textbook, school textbooks or university textbooks, that the Zulu exploded while Shaka was king of the Zulu in the early 19th century, from about 1815. And they sent neighboring groups off in all directions, some south like the Fingo, some west like the Ngwani, some north like the Ngoni. It set up a pattern of movements throughout the subcontinent. Some Ngoni groups went up as far as Lake Victoria. It affected everything. Let me say that this concept emerged in settler mythology in the 1830s. But this word Mfecane was only coined by a white man in 1928, exactly 100 years after Shaka was assassinated. But even then, the word was not really taken up by academics. It only became popularized and universalized and went into the hairdresser salon and the other places where ordinary people who are not academics and study history read these things, into the cinema and so on. It only went into those places in the 1960s with the publication of Omar Cooper's Zulu Aftermath. You'll find that people who are at university in the 1950s or at school in the 1950s very often haven't heard of this, but from the late 60s onwards, nobody has not heard of it. That pattern is straightforward. In fact, its straightforwardness is one of the major reasons why it's been so popular. Even an idiot can understand it. And of course, myths are for idiots. For us, in other words. But when you accept this pattern up there, the Mfecane, when you accept it, this is what you also accept. This is the little writing at the bottom of the page, which you accept by definition when you accept the Zulu-centric Mfecane. You accept that Africans, because of the Zulu, depopulated the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, Natal. You accept that. You accept that Africans, the Mfecane, created ethnic nations in rebound from the Zulu, the Sotho, for example, or the Ndebele, or the Swazi. They were all created by the Mfecane. They all emerged during that period, that phase of history. You also accept that these ethnic nations, which were caused by the Mfecane, came to constitute the nuclei of the later Bantustans. Therefore, and this is the reasoning, and let me say this is stated quite clearly in school textbooks, the modern Bantustans go back to Shaka, or otherwise Shaka created the Bantustans, or he set history into motion leading to the Bantustans. It wasn't us that did it, it was them. You're also accepting this idea that blacks are inherently violent. They do this sort of thing. The Zulu are Zulu because they are Zulu, obviously. And therefore they need to be rescued by civilization. You accept that. That's the whole major theme of South African colonial mythology. All those things you accept. If I may quote Jeff Guy, he put this very nicely when we had a debate about this matter in Durban recently. He said, the Mfecane itself, put forward as a reply to Trevor Roper, who used to go on about mindless gyrations of barbarians in picturesque corners of the world. He says, the Mfecane replied to Trevor Roper, but in fact, the most mindless and barbaric gyration of them all. You can see this is a gyration, yes? It's a gyration. Africans gyrate. That helps define them as Africans. So this is the first point I want to make. I'm going to come back to this point. I have just defined the Mfecane, all right? It's quite simple. Now, what we are saying is that that map is fantasy. Didn't happen like that at all. Let me present you with an alternative construct which is actually rooted in evidence. This is not rooted in evidence. You'll see there two or three stark differences. The first is that the Zulu have shrunk in size somewhat considerably. The Zulu aren't the center of the world at all. The Zulu in a blue ring are in fact paralleled by a grouping of other blue rings. You can see them, the Soto state of Moshweshwe in the Caledon, Lesotho area, the Swazi in the Swaziland area, the Pedi in the northeastern Transvaal, the Gaza in the lower Limpopo Valley. What we have done here is to reduce the Zulu and elevate the others into parallel formations, so that we can see that the Zulu are one of a number of sister formations that emerged in this era. They didn't cause anything on the big scale, in the same way that the Swazi didn't cause anything on the big scale. That's the first thing. I call these things reactive states, but academics are terribly worried about the word reactive. It sounds like too positive, too much as if Africans can react, or maybe reacting is inherently a defensive thing or something like that. Anyway, people don't like that term, but I'm going to stick with it, I think. You can see here that we've brought in other things. We've brought in here the impact of the British and the Boers in the south. That impact really got going after about 1810. We've also brought in, secondly, the impact of white surrogate groups, the Griqua groups in the Orange Free State area, or what was to become that. These horsemen were raiding all over Transranja to north of the Vaal, causing mayhem and havoc as they raided cattle and slaves. What were they doing with those slaves? They were actually taking them south into the Cape Colony. The 1820 settlers, which you probably heard about, came out in 1820 and immediately craved labor, and therefore the Griqua were slave raiding from about 1822. The timing is, of course, perfect. Thirdly, we have, on the east coast, Portuguese slaving in and around Delagoa Bay, also in Nyambane and other points along that coast. There is quite a debate going on, a micro debate within the larger debate as to when that Portuguese slaving really became significant. But we can go into that in one of the sessions. The main point is it happened, certainly by the 1820s, it was significant. It was causing a lot of problems in the hinterland of Delagoa Bay. And the general counter-hypothesis is, in a sentence, that the Zulu and the other defensive states, all of which were of the same type, were in response to these penetrations of what one can in the jargon call the impact or the penetration of the world economy in the colony from the bay. The slaves, by the way, taken out of Delagoa Bay were mostly going to Brazil, but quite a few were also going to sugar plantations in the Indian Ocean. Two or 3 points while we're still with this map. The first thing is that we are not removing the Zulu from history. They are there still. We haven't dissolved them in a bath of acid or anything like that. They're still causing tremendous havoc in their own area. They're still pretty bloodthirsty. We think that they were also slaving. They were one of the paradoxical formations, if it's paradoxical. They both created themselves in response to an external impact, but they then went along with it and became part of it, merging Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism into one non-thing, where the words themselves become meaningless. They're there. The other point I'd like to make while we've got this map up is that you can see here that South African history is not unique. The impact of the slave trade, bringing in the British and the Griqua, bringing in the external impact, enables us historically now to link up the Southern African experience in these decades with the experiences of Africans in West Africa and in East Africa. We can cut through what one of my colleagues used to call the Boerewors line, which is the Limpopo. In other words, everything up there happened according to the way things did happen in Africa, but down here, south of the Limpopo Boerewors line, things happened according to its own logic, the Mfecane. That was our thing. Now we can get away from that. That on the one hand. But on the other hand, you'll notice that what did happen down here was pretty strange. There was one unique thing down in the south which didn't happen anywhere else in Africa as it happens, and that thing was not the Zulu. the thing that was unique about the South was not even Portuguese slaving. What was unique about the South was the colonial impact. Nowhere else in Africa did you have this combination, this simultaneous, synchronous combination of the penetration of a slave trade, an external slave trade, with the impact of a settler colonialism, which itself was grabbing labor. It was even historically unique, because later, when we had colonies in Africa after the 1890s, although there were quasi-forms of forced labor, there was not direct slaving. That colony, the Cape Colony, was slaving. You had two forms of slaving. In fact, there were areas, for example, in the northeastern Orange Free State, where you had overlaps of the slaving penetration. Some slaves were exported out of the bay and went to Brazil. Other slaves were brought south by Greek or by white farmers and were put to work on settler farms in situ inside South Africa, southern Africa, the Cape. So there you see it. We have two starkly opposed and incompatible paradigms, interpretations. You will see at once that they are incompatible. And one thing that we want to do is to make up our minds about which is preferable. Let me just give you three brief examples. I'm not sure if I have time for three, maybe two. At every micro level of study, you'll find the same incompatibility. It doesn't just occur at the big level. Let me show you the Mfecane version of the Kololo movements. Here we get down to a bit of detail. I'm not going to overburden you with detail. The Kololo movements are very interesting. According to the Mfecane interpretation, the Zulu explode. They push Shlubi and other groups westwards. They hit other groups like the Tlokwe, who gyrate and, like billiard balls, move in turn westwards. And they hit a group called the Kololo, who started off life in this north-central Orange Free State. The Kololo then, like the fifth billiard ball in the impact, roll on. They cross the Vaal. They gyrate. They're Zuluized because this is a contagious thing. They move south and they start trying to attack the Greek crustacean, frothing at the mouth. They are then turned off by a heroic little band of Greek horsemen and a couple of missionaries who are just doing their duty. And they rebound, because rebounding was one of their characteristics, all the way up to Zambia, where they continue to maraud and gyrate and generally behave like the Zulu. Okay, clear enough, simple to understand. Insofar as that's dealt with in the textbooks, that's what you get. It didn't happen like that. Somewhat revealingly, it happened like this. We don't have the finer detail, but we have the broad detail. The Kololo did indeed start off in the north-central Orange Free State. They were hit by something in the southwest. We're not quite sure what it was. It may have been the Taung. They moved eastwards in the opposite direction. They moved into the northeastern Orange Free State, maybe the Bethlehem, Harrismith area. They were then attacked by slavers, not by Zulu, coming from Delagoa Bay or Inyambane, but probably the Bay. They were then forced, those survivors, because many landed up in the Indian Ocean or in Brazil, they were then forced to cross the southern and western Transvaal into what is today southeastern Botswana, where they, of course, became a nuisance to people already established there, obviously. They were then attacked in 1826 by the Ngwaketsi using white mercenaries. They were propelled northwards by stages, indeed, into southwestern Zambia, where they set themselves up as a defensive reactive state. And by the early 1850s, they were in turn slaving and sending slaves out both to the Portuguese on the west coast and to the Arabs on the east coast. That we know. It's a very interesting history, a formidable history, an astonishing history, but you can see it's quite incompatible with that of the Mfecane. The Zulu don't enter the picture at all. Give you one other example. The Fingo. I hate to say it, the Fingo are going to take a battering at this conference. Let me say too that if you want to preserve your Mfecane, then you're going to have to answer the Fingo case. But again, you can come on to that on Saturday or Sunday. The Fingo, there you see the Zulu, they explode, they erupt. They massacre the people in Natal. They depopulate Natal, by the way. Did I say that? Probably. And they rub up a people called the Mbo in western Natal. Now, there were 720,000 Mbo. The Zulu massacred 690,000 of these. Just one of their daily chores. They sent the survivors south through the Transkei, where they were welcomed at first by people called the Qaleka, the southern Xhosa, and there, but the Qaleka, being the Qaleka, started to enslave them and behave generally in a very beastly way towards the Mbo, who now are called Fingos. And so dreadful was their treatment that in 1835 the British Army, a well-known humanitarian organization, had to move in and rescue them, which they did. They put up kindly missionaries to administer to their needs and requirements and brought them into the colony and gave them status of citizens, and everything ended happily ever after. Now, one laughs. This is the point I want to make. People do laugh. But nobody laughed until the past 2 years. This view comes in a 1912 book by Aleph and Whiteside called History of the Mbo. You laugh merely because of the inflection in my voice. But the finest historians have repeated this nonsense right the way down to 1990. I can give you examples. I can assure you it didn't happen like that. What actually happened was a bit more complex and a bit more nasty. Again, the Zulu don't enter into the picture. This is a tiny bit overcomplicated, but I can explain it, I hope, succinctly. The Zulu are there, reactive state, not in this case intervening in history very formidably. The Fingo are in fact a creation, a mythical creation of the British Army in 1835. In 1835 the British Army erupts, the only eruption was of the British Army, into the Ciskei. They smash the Harbe to bits, they kill 4,000 or 5,000 of their people. In April 1835, they cross the Kai and they slaughter the Qaleka. They raid as far north as the Umtata River, covering up their traces as far as they can, because all this is not really sanctioned by the Colonial Office in London. And while they're doing this, they bring in thousands of Qaleka and Harbe labourers into the colony, because the colony is very short of labour. We're not quite sure how many labourers they brought in. They said 16,000. It may have been less than that, it may have been more than that. We really don't know. These Fingos, as they called them, these Xhosa labourers, were put into holding camps at various places in the Eastern Cape. They were then sent round to where they were needed. The land that was taken from Africans was immediately apportioned out to white farmers, and many of them were put on to work on the white farms. But many of the Fingos also went to the towns, like Grahamstown and to Port Elizabeth. Many others were sent westwards as far as Cape Town. It is true that we have a group, the Hlubi Ngwane, who were pushed into the Caledon Valley, not through the Transkei, by, we think, slavers. In the Caledon Valley, Jeff Perez disputes this, they were hit by Griqua. Some survivors, the Ngwane, Hlubi, Bele, Zizi, just a few, moved south into what is today the southern Transkei. And some of those were attacked for labour by the British Army in 1828. They were brought into the colony, put into holding camps in 1829, and then they were distributed around the colony, Hlubi Ngwane, and they also became subsumed under the title Fingo. However, let me stress that these people, some of whom did in fact come down from what is effectively Western Natal, and did have holes in their ears, there may have been 200 or 300 of them. All right? All the rest were local Xhosa. So the people, those Fingo from Western Natal, may have been 5%, if that, of the total number, and they weren't pushed south by Shaka. So we can see that a dreadful, dreadful thing happened in 1835. You can read more about it in Alan Webster's paper. Those are just two examples. Let me just give you briefly the third example of the Zulu state itself. I think I have time, and this is after all an important one. The Mfecane version of the Zulu state of Shaka is something like this. The map is a larger scale map. I've put the Zulu there little bit to the north of the Mfecane River, but the red line indicates roughly the area of their total immediate domination. The area to the south of the Tugela River is, by universal agreement, depopulated, of course by the Zulu. Well, why the Zulu should have wanted to depopulate that area, nobody's ever said. But their control extended south into what is today the northern Transkei, and in the north their control extended as far as Delagoa Bay. Within the area you have a militarized, centralized state. Around it you have terrified people fleeing from them. Nothing could be clearer, and nothing could be falser. When you get down to the specific example of the Zulu, I got my last map, you see a rather more complicated picture. You will see a more detailed map in my own paper called Overturning the Mfecane. But here's a brief sketch of it. The Zulu themselves are a much, much, much smaller formation. The Zulu grouping began in the north, in the White Mfecane Valley.
I apologize.
Will it light again? You'll note, looking at this map, just to get back to the map, that the northern boundary of the Zulu state was, in fact, the northern part of the Mfecane Valley. The Zulu state itself was moving south between about 1815 and 1825, represented by the blue arrows. The Zulu center itself had, by 1825, moved south into Natal itself. The Zulu state, therefore, was itself partly in Natal. The Tugela was not a boundary of any sort. It was, in fact, the heartland of the Zulu state. What is today the northern part of Natal was within the Zulu state. Central Natal and southern Natal were not depopulated. It was a much smaller state. Their rule did not extend towards Delagoa Bay. Between them and Delagoa Bay existed very, very powerful slave estates like Maputo and Tembe. I haven't put the Ndwandwe on this map, but the Ndwandwe were immediately to the north of the Zulu. We suspect the Ndwandwe were slaving. The slaving raids are indicated by the red arrows. The Hlubi and Ngwane, for example, who were to the northwest of the Zulu, were pushed inland by a force which was not the Zulu. We can also see that, for example, the Hlubi, and this is represented by the green arrows, many Hlubi migrated southeastwards into the Zulu state. Many other groups, including Ndwandwe groups, moved south into the Zulu state. The Zulu state was built up from refugees as well as from people who were already resident in the area. It was that type of state. It was one of a grouping of 4 reactive or defensive clusters in the general region, the other 3 being the Swazi, the Sotho Kingdom of Mshweshwe, and the Pedi Maritime state of Tulare and Sekwati in the northeastern Transvaal, which I haven't put on this map. The last point I'd like to make is I've indicated these by little blue circles. The little blue circles represent mountain strongholds to which other groups migrated for protection for some sort. There are 2 major clusters, one on the left of the map in the Caledon Valley. The Tlokwa, for example, went to live on a mountain fortress called Marabeng, which is near modern Vicksburg. But there's another cluster to the north of the Zulu state, to the northwest of the Zulu state, where the low veld meets the high veld. There's mountains like the Ngome forest. They go all the way up into what is today Swaziland, where there were mountain strongholds where groups moved into in this period, between about 1800 and 1825. I'd just like to make the point at this stage that these mountain strongholds are not configurated because of the drought, and neither are they configurated so because of the Zulu. So that is the Zulu situation. One last point on the Zulu, it's the point I'm going to make again and again and again, which is the specific organizational structures of the Zulu state. Its Amabuto system, that's its regimental system, and its fortresses, its stockaded village system of Amakanda. these didn't just happen, they require an explanation. Why did the specific structural forms of the Zulu state emerge precisely as they did? Because I can assure you they were quite unique. Although the reactive states bore superstructural, general resemblances to each other, at the micro level they were all structured very differently. Therefore, the specific structural features of the Zulu kingdom require specific explanations, and I think this is one thing that the historians are now going to move on to. There, I will complete my examples. Let me now come on to another point. The Mfecane is a mythology integrated into South Africa's school and university textbooks. When you read about the Mfecane, for example, in school textbooks, you read about Africans. The texts are invariably written by whites, but here you are dealing with Africans, blacks. And when you're dealing in the chapterlets or the chapters or the subsections dealing with the Mfecane, there are no whites visible at all. They don't come into those chapters. They usually belong to the second half of the book or maybe to other books altogether. Therefore, in this sense, the Mfecane is an Afrocentric form of history. Let me say that in this sense, the word has been coined. It is a neologism. Afrocentrism means a situation where you are merely writing about blacks as if no other people existed at all. The Mfecane, therefore, excludes whites altogether. You can see, therefore, this is a bit silly to call it a Eurocentric explanation. It's Eurocentric tautologically in the sense that Europeans invented it. But in the sense that Europeans are present within the historical action, it is the opposite of Eurocentric, because the Europeans don't appear at all. It is Afrocentric. Clear? I think that is a clear point to make, but that has been misunderstood by recent critics, counter-critics of the critique of the Mfecane. We've been accused of going back to old-fashioned Eurocentric versions of history. This is their view. They say, you're going back to Eurocentric versions of history, implying that's what the settlers used to write, say back in the 1940s or 50s. But didn't you know the liberal Africanists of the 1960s and 70s changed all that? We got beyond that sort of nonsense 20 or 30 years ago. What are you going back to it for? That's what they're saying. Now, my answer to that is then come and look at South African historiography. Come and just look at it. Come and look what existed in Thiel and in Corey. Come and look what existed in E.A. Walker's textbooks. Come and look what existed there in the 1950s. Go and read Omar Cooper's Zulu Aftermath. They're terribly forgetful, these people. They often forget what they actually wrote at the time. You'll find that the liberal Africanists, insofar as such a genre existed of the 60s and 70s, simply repeated the Mfecane. They took over this thing from the old settler mythmakers of the 1830s, and they just developed it, in my view, somewhat mindlessly. They provided a sort of what I would say an Africanist syrup with which the old race pill could be swallowed. That was their only contribution, was to legitimate the idea, to ensure that it spread, to provide a medium by which it could spread. That's what they did. One thing we'd like to get them to accept is that is in fact what they did. But they are very forgetful people. Now, this general sequence of Afrocentric, but nevertheless written by Europeans, mythology, you'll see a lot of the papers point to this fact, represent repetitions, mindless repetitions by white historians, university historians. Not here talking so much about school teachers, because school teachers can be forgiven for having roughly to accept what the textbooks are, but university lecturers and professors are there in business to precisely think about what it is they're teaching. They're meant to do research. But the striking feature of all this is the mindless repetition. In fact, it's worse than that often. It's very often plagiarism. We can look even to the most respected books, and we find plagiarism, the repetition, in the most respected texts. I won't give you examples, but I can assure you we can give you examples. So what I'd say is that we're not, generally, I've been accused of saying that that is a conspiracy. I've been accused of a purveyor of conspiracy theories. I don't know what it is. I haven't used the phrase conspiracy theory for that process. It is a complex process of the evolution of a colonial settler mythology. We haven't had a study of it yet. I would say that there are little conspiracies. We can give you examples of those. For example, in 1835, there was a conspiracy to prevent the public and the colonial office in London from finding out what the Fingo were. That was a deliberate conspiracy, I can assure you. But the big thing, the Mfecane, the big thing of the 70s and 80s, the situation where you had everybody accepting this, that's not a conspiracy in the normal sense. That's a very, very complicated process which hasn't yet been unraveled. But what I would say, what is striking about this whole evolution is what I would call the fertile negligence of South Africa's historical profession, that they haven't rumbled to this a long, long time ago. It is to me incredible that it is only in the later part of the 1980s that we first got onto this. I have no explanation for this, although I've got my thoughts about how it happened that way. And I believe, and John Wright and I both are agreed on this point, that we badly need an inquest into this matter, why it was that this happened. We think that a book should be written on this issue alone. Now, the next point I want to make, relatedly, is that what I am, my object, well, what I'm going to try to urge you to do is to get rid of the Mfecane, to get rid of it altogether. I don't want you to revise it, to rethink it, to rehabilitate it, to make it respectable, to salvage something from it. I want you to demolish it. I have written a number of somewhat polemical papers with things like the case against the Mfecane, demolish the Mfecane, jettison the Mfecane, overturn the Mfecane. I shall go on searching the thesaurus for synonyms for this until the job is done. But, of course, this is very embarrassing. You can't just get rid of the Mfecane. It would be as if we said, let's take out a man's liver and expect him to live. You can't do it. You can't remove the Mfecane without incredible complications. It's like a cancer. There it is. You can take it out, but you pull so much out with it that the history dies. It can't exist any longer. It's so central. The Mfecane, the one reason why we've had so much interest in this theme, affects so many related areas of history. Indeed, so many related so-called disciplines like anthropology and archaeology and so forth. My metaphor would be, if you know England's railway system, it's like the Clapham Junction of South Africa's history with a faulty signal box. Clapham Junction is where you have about 8 or 9 trains, 10 trains going through every minute, for every minute of the day, through Clapham Junction. Now, if all your signals are faulty, then you have a general mess. And that's what we've got. You'll find that with the Mfecane in place, nothing in 19th century history makes sense. Nothing adds up at all. You can't write 19th century South African history with the Mfecane in situ. Promisingly already, if we take it out, we can suddenly see some things begin to make sense. We can begin to start reassembling this animal, this 19th century history. We begin to make sense of it. Removing it, however, throws up huge fields of research. At the moment, the counter-hypothesis, the counter-paradigm, as some people are calling it, is at a very, very sketchy stage. There are 2 jobs to do, and they shouldn't be confused. The first is the job that I'm concerned with at the moment, which is to get rid of the thing altogether. It's essentially a negative job. We have a mythology, and you come along and the idea is to get rid of the mythology. The idea is to cut it out. That is the one job that we're doing. When it was seen that that was all that we were attempting to do, a lot of very awkward people started to ask questions like, well, okay, you've got rid of the Mfecane, what are you going to put in its place? And basically, I really didn't know. I mean, I knew roughly that we had to bring in the Portuguese slaving, that we had to bring in Greek, and we had to bring in the British Army and so forth. But beyond that, I didn't really know. I was not personally terribly interested at that time. It was only a few wicked students at Rhodes University back in the early 80s who began to insist on things like the importance of the slave trade. But I do want to make a clear distinction between the negative job of getting rid of the mythology and the positive job of reconstructing a history to put in its place. Inevitably, these two processes are confusable. One tends to end up doing the two things at once, especially in short papers, especially when in these initial stages, one tends to say, the Mfecane must be knocked down, and this is what we must put it into its place. Now, obviously, what to put in its place at this moment, we can only arrive at the sketchiest details. So let me here make a clear distinction between what I regard as what is perfectly permissible is to debate, to interrogate, to reject, to argue against, to try to refine, to try to go beyond the suggestions which have been made as to what to replace the Mfecane with. So far, they are only suggestions. They are incredibly crude. Accept that. For God's sake, there have been no books yet. We've had to do this in 3 or 4 pages just to, like, ring a loud bell to announce to people that there is a problem. But please don't confuse that with getting rid of the Mfecane altogether. That is a separate issue. And at this conference, I'd very much like you to bear the separability of these two tasks in mind. If you're making your comments, it would generally help if you could at least to yourself, say to yourself, am I trying to disagree with the fact that it was a mythology and therefore we shouldn't get rid of it because it wasn't a mythology, and therefore the first task, the negative task of demolishing the mythology is something that should be objected to? We've had very few objections on that level so far on that score. Or ask yourself equally well whether you are in principle generally accepting that it was a mythology, should be got rid of, but that the propounders of new viewpoints simply haven't got it right yet. If you could make that reasonably clear, at least in your own minds. I say that because the counter-critiques that have been coming in the past year have shown confusion on this central point. One of the papers that you've got in front of you over the weekend is a paper by Elizabeth Eldridge, an American historian, who has made this confusion. And it's a very, very important point, possibly the most important one I shall make this evening, which is that some historians are now trying to change the definition of the Mfecane. Now, I want to go back to the first point that I made. What is the Mfecane? What are we questioning? This thing. As I said, it's a word that was only coined in 1928. It was only fully developed as an idea, a mythology in the 1960s. The Mfecane is the Zulu Revolution. It is the Sharkan Revolution. That's what it means. Indeed, some historians have tried to get away from the problem by merely using the alternative definition, the Sharkan Revolution, missing about 50 points all at once in doing so. Whether you call it the Sharkan Revolution, the Zulu Revolution, or the Mfecane is immaterial, as long as you know what you're talking about. This explosion, this time of troubles caused by the Zulu, this monstrous event, this eruption, this thing which extended all over Africa, centers on the Zulu. That is the Mfecane. Again, I think that point is clear. You can go and check in the textbooks to see that my definition is correct. Yet, recently, and Eldridge is an example, there's been a tacit, I think unconscious, I don't think this is a deliberate thing. It is a sign of confusion in the minds of the writer. They've subtly changed its meaning. The Mfecane now, according to this type of writer, means generalized time of troubles. You can get rid of the Zulu. Sure, get rid of the Zulu, so you've got your Mfecane still. They say, yes, of course there were times of troubles. There wasn't Mfecane. getting rid of the Zulu, now we can get to the true roots of the Mfecane, is what they say. But let me say that such a proposition is complete nonsense. If you get rid of Zulu centricism, there's no Mfecane. It's gone. Finished. Poof. Bang. It's not there any longer. For example, my attack on Zulu centricism and my bringing in of the slave trade has been referred to as Cobbing's version of the Mfecane. Now you see at once that that is a complete contradiction in terms. We are not denying that there were considerable upheavals in this era. What we are concerned with is the inadmissible Zulu centricism of Mfecane accounts, and the fact that in arriving at explanations, so much has been left out. Yes, I say that is the most important point to make. You can't redefine the Mfecane as generalized time of troubles. You can't have an Mfecane caused by the slave trade. The Mfecane can only be caused by the Zulu. Now, a related point is there's been quite a bit of talk about two paradigms. There was the Zulu-centric Mfecane, which is your one paradigm, and there is the new, well, what should we call it? Well, insofar as there has been a title for the new approach, it is the interaction paradigm. We are looking at interactions between disparate groups of people who had different color skins. In fact, the new approach is essentially non-racial. You'll find that we've got blacks and whites and so-called coloreds and Greek were all doing the same thing. They're all involved with each other. Eventually, of course, in Southern Africa, the whites come out on top. What we are looking at, rather, is the conflict between two unequal general systems. But nevertheless, is it a good idea to use the word paradigm, both for the Mfecane and for the anti-Mfecane? I think this is quite an important point. We found generally, in fact, we can almost play on this. We can almost seduce you into this. People don't like letting go of their paradigms. It's like rails in which you can walk along. You don't have to think. The Mfecane was one way in which you didn't have to think. Once we remove that, then people start getting psychologically disturbed, very worried about this. But then we present you with a new paradigm. You see, everybody clutches onto it. You see, and then that's all right. You've got a new paradigm. That's okay. Everyone's happy again. And if you're in the middle, then it's a bit confusing. And we can see that process actually happening. From my point of view, one of the most interesting facets of this whole process is the way in which we can almost manipulate it so that people, that the I don't know, what do you call it, hegemonic class, the academic profession, I'm not sure, come all to think the same. Everybody is rushing to think the same thing. They only want to think the same. And what I'm suggesting is that that is a thoroughly dangerous situation for us to be in. We can get rid of the Mfecane. That was precisely why the Mfecane survived and developed like it did, because everybody was anxious to think the same. We would say that once you've got rid of the Mfecane, we are in a completely new world. There are any number of conceivable macro interpretations of what happened. Any one of a number of interpretations of micro events. Goodness knows what's going to come out of all this. Goodness knows how it will be written up in 20 or 30 years' time. The only thing I do know is that that won't exist any longer. We call it the abyss. There you are. Get away from paradigms. Move into the abyss. You'll be terrified at first, uncomfortable. It's psychically sometimes disturbing. You've got to be, in a way, strong to survive in it for very long. But once you're in it, all sorts of exciting things happen to you. Lastly, there have been two general criticisms which I think it's important to isolate at this stage. The first is that we are not dealing with internal African trajectories. True enough, we haven't spent enough time on that yet, but please don't think that we are disregarding those. You'll find that in the marrying of external impacts and the internal trajectories, we can arrive at nuanced explanations of what are happening in local areas. We're not discounting that. It has been certainly a fault of the way the case has been presented against the Mfecane so far that more notice of these internal trajectories hasn't been taken yet. That is quite true. But it is in no way incompatible with the new, I was going to say paradigm, but shouldn't, all right? The next thing is, and this has been said so often, for God's sake, you've got slavers coming in the British Army, the Greek were there, where is the room for African initiative? Isn't it a bit insulting to Africans? What you are saying, they say, is that Africans can't make their own history. And I can only shake my head at such nonsense. Yet it has been repeated many times. To say that, for example, the Zulu state emerged in reaction to a certain combination of events which included slavers, how does that rob them of initiative? How does that so? How does the new explanation which sees the rise of Mshweshwe's Soto state as being mainly a product of the eruption of the colony and of Griquas, how does that rob Mshweshwe of initiative? How does it rob Africans of initiative? It doesn't at all. I find the general idea that as soon as you bring in a European impact, that suddenly it is assumed that therefore you rob Africans of the will to make their own history, to be profoundly patronizing. No one has raised that type of objection, for example, in the 1890s, when everyone understands that throughout Africa the colonial impact affected African societies. And so it was in the 1820s. Do remember that the colonial impact is much earlier in southern Africa than in eastern and western Africa, 70 or 80 years earlier. What we are seeing in southern Africa in the 1810s and 1820s is rather similar, mutatis mutandis, to what is going to occur in the rest of Africa in the 1890s after the scramble begins. So let me reiterate lastly, to end, that I want the Mfecane to be abandoned, to be eliminated. The quest is to get rid of it from the textbooks. You will find that if you want to write overview histories, either for school textbooks or for university textbooks or for lecture courses, let me tell you this, the best way to do it is to forget the Mfecane. Absorb the message that is untenable, chew it over, toss it in the dustbin, get down to writing your history, and don't even use the word, even in inverted commas. Life will be so much easier without it, all right? And what I'd like to say too is, nevertheless, this is going to be a debating weekend. If you are uneasy with anything, please come out and say so. We prefer that you didn't hide in the woods. We prefer you came out into the open and say what you had to say. We will try and say what we have to say, but don't forget that very often the deeper positions can only come out in response to interventions. The more you intervene, the more likely it is that exciting things will be said. All I can say is that we have got strong positions. We have got deeply defended positions. But don't be frightened of that. Come and take us on. Thank you.
Explosion that took place, supposedly took place in the 1820s, as a result of the supposedly explosive emergence of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka. Okay, now moving on to the debate quickly. Just a couple of points first of all. What I'm going to be saying here is very much my own views in a situation that is being contested. I am one of the people who has been responsible for knocking down the notion of the Mfecane. That obviously colors my views. There are other views. I hope they can come out later on in discussion, later on in the day. And the second point is that, appearances notwithstanding, the issues here are actually quite simple. Let's get away from the notion that you've got to deal with something very complicated. The debate, as it's gone so far, is actually quite simple. What is not simple is what follows after. The whole empirical discussion which is going to come up about over the next 20 or 30 years. But that's not really our concern here. It is the issues in this debate at the moment. Just a very brief background on this notion of the Mfecane. Let's just get established in our minds that it dates right back to the 1880s, 1890s. It wasn't called that then. It was called the Zulu Wars, the Wars of Shaka, those kind of phrases. Systematized for the first time in that period about 100 years ago by Thiel, George McCall Thiel, the first of the Southern Africanist historians, the settler historians, as he's been called. The notion of the Zulu Wars, the Wars of Shaka, lasts right up until the 1960s, when Omar Cooper relabels it the Mfecane in 1966, his book, The Zulu Aftermath. The content doesn't change very much, the label does, the name, Mfecane. Where it comes from, that actual word we can discuss later on. The Mfecane remains uncontested in the literature by academics until Julian Cobbing's work, dating from 1983, the first of his papers critiquing the Mfecane. Again, you can ask him later on today why he came to that position. I'm not going to go into that now. But what we're talking about here now is the culmination of a process that dates back about 8 years. The beginnings of this critique, the beginnings of wondering whether the Mfecane really works, whether it's not in fact an obstacle to analysis of the history of the late 18th century, early 19th century in southern Africa as a whole, not just the Zululand Natal region. The later 1980s, other people start coming into the debate, some of Julian's students, myself. In the last year or so, there have been a number of workshops, one in Maritzburg where something of this debate was aired, another one in Durban. But now we have this colloquium over the last 2 days, the first full-scale discussion of the notion of the Mfecane. The results, just to summarize very briefly, I think were threefold, or three important things coming out. First of all, there was broad agreement among the academics who were at the colloquium over the last 2 days that the Mfecane has to go. It wasn't clear-cut agreement. There are a number of people unhappy with this. There are a range of positions on this. Some people probably still want to hold on to it. But by and large, I think it's true to say that the consensus was, reluctant, however, may have been in some quarters, that we've got to move on from it. So the Mfecane died, in a sense, on the 8th of September, 1991. After a life of 25 years as the Mfecane, and a life of something over 100 years as the Zulu Wars or the Wars of Shaka. The second thing emerging was why? And I want to talk about that in some detail. Thirdly, what do we put in its place? And then fourthly, also importantly, how do we set about putting something in its place? There was, I must record, a lot of uneasiness expressed by numbers of people at the colloquium about the way that various people were using evidence. It's not just a matter of putting a new set of empirical facts in front of other academics, other audiences. It's the actual business of how we set about doing that. What is evidence? Where does it come from? How do we use it in an academic kind of way? Now, very briefly, why must the Zulu-centric Mfecane go? Is that focused? I'm using here a map from Leonard Thompson's recent book on South African history, where he in fact has the Mfecane in a nutshell, the stereotype. The Zulu nuclear area there, from which arrows rush out, representing migrations, forced migrations of groups being pushed out by the Zulu kingdom, emerging here. So-called Fingos or Mfengu being pushed down here, other people being pushed up onto the Highveld, and a whole chain reaction of violence across the Highveld, the southern Highveld, others being pushed onto the northern Highveld, similar chain reactions, others being pushed into southern Mozambique. Now, what is coming out from empirical evidence from a number of people, academics, researchers engaged in this, is that this kind of schema, by and large, doesn't hold. Here at the very center, the Zulu kingdom and its nature are being totally rethought. There was no explosion, Zulu explosion in the 1820s. And we cannot understand the period of the 1820s simply in terms of a short-term history. It's clear now that we've got to go right back to the 1750s, 1760s, something like that, to understand the nature of the political changes that were taking place in this eastern seaboard region here, and in fact, as we'll see, over much of the rest of southern Africa. So the time scale is greatly increased. We're going back to the 1750s, long before Shaka was ever born, long before the Zulu kingdom had ever come into existence. The Zulu kingdom itself, it's becoming clear, is itself a product of a whole period of political change that begins sometime in the mid-18th century. There's still debate about what caused that series of changes. I myself, like a number of other people, think that it had to do with the expansion of the ivory trade from Delagoa Bay in the late 18th century, within a cattle trade, and then, as Julian Cobbing has stressed, a slave trade on top of that in the early 19th century. But these issues are still very much up for debate. What is not really up for debate is that length of time scale. We've got to go back to the mid-18th century and look for causes that had nothing to do with Shaka and the Zulu. And then if you look at each of these individual arrows, these supposed forced migrations stemming from this nuclear area, the supposed nuclear area, you find either that they collapse completely or that they have to be very heavily modified. The Zulu did not raid into Natal, as they're commonly supposed to have done, and depopulate the place. Natal was not actually depopulated. I've written a whole PhD on the subject and come up with a rather different view. Numbers of people remained in Natal. Yes, the Zulu were a factor in the politics of the period. One can't write them out completely. One certainly doesn't. They were important, perhaps eventually the major factor. But they were not the only factor, and Natal was not depopulated. People were not just sent holus bolus out of it. There was no major Thingo eruption down into the Cape. Similarly, on the Highveld, the groups that were pushed up into the Highveld here, yes, the Zulu did play some role at some of the time in pushing some of those groups onto the Highveld. But it's a much more complex picture than we've imagined so far. And to come back to Julian's Cobbing, his position, what we're seeing here on the Highveld is not simply a spillover from the east, if that's happening at all, but a push from the Cape frontier of numbers of what we can simply call raiding bands. Griqua, Korana, Hoi, San, Whites, Xhosa speakers, Sotho speakers. Raiding and trading into this area from the Cape. Raiding for cattle, hunting for ivory. Raiding also, as Julian would stress, for slaves. Again, there's a good deal of debate about the particular stress on any one of these factors, whether it's slaves, cattle, ivory. People are taking up very different positions on these sort of issues. Well, what is generally being accepted is that frontier influence must be fed into the equation about what is going on in the interior of Southern Africa. It cannot simply be ascribed to the Zulu, if in any senses at all. The Cape frontier and what's going on there, and the whole world of capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, settlerism that lies behind it, has to be brought into the equation. And similarly, Julian would argue that the trade from Delagoa Bay reaches right across the continent and feeds into what's going on in the interior. And I think numbers of other people are coming up with this idea as well. Not necessarily slaves, again, major debate about that. Is it slaves? Is it something else? Different positions being taken up, very different positions, and major debates, arguments developing about that one. But again, the notion that in the later 18th century, the long-distance trade from Delagoa Bay was reaching deep into the interior. And if I had a larger map, I would be showing now how other researchers are actually feeding in Namibia, Botswana, and places north into this whole scenario as well. So what we're getting, as well as a much longer time scale, is a much wider space in which to reconceive of the history of Southern Africa in this period. We're not just focusing on this area here, the Zulu bursting out from the east. in southern Africa as a whole, not just South Africa, southern Africa, in which these forces from outside were having all sorts of effects depending very much on local conditions. What those local conditions were, we've hardly started debating about. But what's coming together now is the notion of internal trajectories inside African society feeding into being affected by these external forces. A much more complex picture than the old Mfecane. The Zulu, of course, still survive. They're very important in this region here, but they can be seen now as simply one of a number of important actors, not the prime actor. Just let me put that onto another overhead, just to get a different notion of scale. Let's get away from that east coast and take a look at this kind of scale. Again, notice this is still the stereotype, but put in a Southern African context, just for you to realize the kind of implications that the old notion of the Mfecane had. There is the Zulu explosion over there. By itself, notice. Here we have the expansion of the Cape, and by implication, white history. We have a segregated history, and this is one of the fundamental products of this whole notion of the Mfecane. It segregates out what was happening in this part of the continent with a supposedly Zulu-centric focus from the expansion of these external forces. We have a history segregated something like that, there and there. An embarrassing overlap on the so-called frontier between whites and Xhosa here, frontier wars, but nevertheless, black people are supposed to have had their own barbaric thing in the interior, these savage wars, while whites, in the older paradigm anyway, were bringing civilization at this end of the frontier, at this end of southern Africa. Just to modernize that, we now have this kind of scenario. It still retains an emphasis on what is going on in the interior of southern Africa. Regional studies remain very important, local initiatives, the internal trajectories of African societies, but also puts more emphasis, much more emphasis, on these external forces. Situating southern Africa in the history of the international economy, the international political and economic order, the coming of imperialism, European-centered influences to southern Africa. How those affect southern Africa is another matter altogether. We can only start, in fact, that's where we are at now, very roughly, in the debate. We can only answer that question through very detailed empirical studies on a region-by-region basis of how different African societies responded in different ways to different kinds of pressures, from ultimately stemming from the outside, and then came up with a whole new set of pressures, and the whole system then moves into yet another phase of change. But the indissoluble link, what remains, is this link now with the outside world. Those pressures, also changing, have been there since at least 1700 in this part of the world, and 1810, 1820s, 1750s. We also need to bring in now, this is very recent research, Namibia also, Zimbabwe, southern Mozambique. They need to be brought back into this map. A much broader picture. That is very roughly the kind of thing which historians are now starting to think about. But I must come back to the point and stress it, that they are starting to do so. There's no, perhaps as I've been putting it a bit blandly, major debates are now starting to emerge around this scenario. Major confrontations, if you like. Not debates, perhaps is too easy a word. Fights, arguments about how people have used evidence. Julian's hypothesis is being critiqued on a number of fronts. He is responding in kind. Whether effectively or not is for other historians to judge. There's a major debate going on about the Delagoa Bay slave trade, for instance. Eldridge has criticized Julian on this ground. Was there actually a slave trade as early as Julian makes out? Julian comes bouncing back with further evidence to say there was. There's a major debate here in Natal. Julian takes one position, Carol and Hamilton takes another, I take a third. We argue, mostly without losing our tempers so far. But there is a major debate, argument. There's no clear-cut consensus. Again, Julian has been criticized for his emphasis on the slave trade in the interior here. Guy Hartley comes back with another view. Other people come up with different views, quite heatedly sometimes. But nevertheless, there is an advance being made on this issue here. Similarly, Eastern Cape. Jeff Perez here criticizing Julian heavily. I, in turn, criticize Jeff Perez. It's an ongoing process of argument beginning. No clear-cut solutions as yet, perhaps unfortunately for teachers. Okay, so at that level, the empirical level, things are starting to get complicated. But I think this is a positive thing. In my view, what is happening now provides an unparalleled opportunity for innovative teachers to get away from the notion of history as a fixed set of facts and moving on to the idea of history as debate. In fact, you have no alternative, no option as far as treating this is concerned. Either you leave it out altogether, which I believe some teachers do, or you have to address it as a debate, as it continues. There's no consensus as to what to put in place of the Mfecane, and there won't be, with luck, for another 20 or 30 years. So the debate will continue for another 20 or 30 years, perhaps even longer. Heavy responsibility then on teachers, in fact, to keep up with this debate and to teach in terms of debate. Also, though, a heavy responsibility on academics to cooperate in producing the necessary texts. So keep pushing us.
He's regarded as the icon.
You're going to need a stand-in. I could have Eddie and the kids here do a quick set to borrow some instruments from the band.
10,000 says the diner will show.
10,000 against Eddie playing.
All right. Hey, man, how long we got to stick around
As
here?
long as I want you here. I'm trying to arrange an impromptu gig for you. The exposure would be incredible.
It's Diana Price's night. I didn't want to be here in the first place.
Guess this is our night to find each other in private moments, huh?
Yeah, I guess so. About ready to take off?
Yeah, let's get it over with.
Okay.
What were you looking for in here?
Well, I was just seeing if I was getting an honest count.
Are you?
I can't tell.
You never will.
Come now, Walter. Nobody's paying advances anymore. We'll buy the kid a stereo and pay the rent on the studio apartment. I'm afraid that's about it.
Well, no Diana, no surprise. At least you have the publishing catalog.
What'd you say, Claudia?
The Dead Dog Publishing catalog has some value.